Thanks, Maureen, and thanks, John, and thanks all of you for being here today. Being here early in the morning. This is my first Kateri Peace Conference. I'm very glad to be part of it. I think that Terry's song was particularly relevant for us today because it's really about building a movement. And that's why I think we're all here. It's about building movements to change the world. Small task, right? But this is what we see. Saint Kateri, of course, lived here in the context of the early days of settler colonialism in this country. Her people, she and her people, were victims of that settler colonialism from the French and the Brits and the Dutch. And we know how that played out. But we have a world to look at these questions. You know, there was a famous Italian philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, who talked about the old world dying and the new world struggling to be born, and that this is the time of monsters. That's what happens in between those two things. When the old world is dying but the new world has not yet been born, there are monsters. And boy, do we have a lot of monsters right now. My city, Washington, D.C., is occupied. ICE is slamming people to the ground and arresting people across the city. FBI and agents and soldiers and National Guard are out on the streets. The cost is about $1 million a day. Imagine what that could be used for to house the entire unhoused population of Washington, D.C. Imagine if that money were to go back to the Treasury instead of to the military budget and be used for jobs and healthcare and education and all the things that we're told there's just not enough money for. Because half of that budget, half of the discretionary budget, goes directly to the military. And half of that goes directly to military corporations. So anybody who says, well, we can't really talk about the military budget because, you know, we don't want to hurt the troops. Yeah, well, the troops are not getting that money, right? Tens of thousands of active duty troops these days make so little money they qualify for food stamps. It's a scandal. It's a scandal. So, you know, this is what we are facing. This is what the time of monsters looks like in the 21st century. You know, when I was preparing for speaking here today, and this has been true preparing for everywhere I've gone, I always want to check the news shortly before I come because the numbers change so fast, right? And you don't want to be up talking about stuff and get it all wrong. The numbers I always qualify and say, well, I think this is the right number. They just change too fast. When we heard about Anas al-Sharif, the young journalist from Al Jazeera who was assassinated by an Israeli strike about a week ago now, maybe a little more than a week. It was a horror. Many of us had known his work. He was one of the leaders of the quickly diminishing journalist cohort in Gaza, and very young. He was only 28 years old for all the work that he's done. But when I went to look up a bit about him, I didn't know much about his background, I found that there were 6 journalists that were killed in that strike, not just Ennis. 6 journalists were killed. You can't keep up with the numbers. You know, it's now over 62,000 people that are known to have been killed by Israeli weapons. Now we know that's a huge undercount. Those are the people, 62,000 people, we have their name, their age, and their ID number. Beyond that are the people who are buried under the rubble. That's estimated between 10 and 15,000 at a minimum. There are people who died at home whose deaths were never registered, who were never buried because their families had to flee because the bombing continued. So we don't know. We don't know. We know that as of, well now this is 2 days ago, 263 people were known to have died of starvation. Of those, 112 were children. And the numbers, particularly of those dying of hunger-related issues, the numbers are going up, not just increasing, but going up exponentially. I think by next week, we will be seeing 100 or more every day dying of starvation because, well, for 2 reasons. One is there is still virtually no food getting in. There are tiny little trickles, which is accessible to almost no one. It's being designed deliberately in a performative way to show off. Countries are dropping food pallets from aircraft. One of those pallets hit and killed a child last week, because that's the danger of dropping food from aircraft. Children run after it. They have not had a decent meal in weeks. Of course they're going to run after it. And what happens? It hits them and kills them. So we're looking at an exponential rise, partly because there's still no food, and partly because the impact of starvation grows and grows in every person. It can't be reduced and reversed overnight. The children who are starving may never recover, because brain development, bone development, all those things doesn't just catch up when you start getting a decent amount of food. It doesn't work that way. So we're talking about a potentially lost generation. This is what genocide looks like. You know, by July 20th of this year, there were 86 people who had been known to have died from hunger-related issues. That was mostly in those last few weeks before July 20th. In the 3 weeks after July 20th, it went from 86 to 222. 86 in the course of a year and a half, from 86 to 222 in the course of 3 weeks. So this is what we are looking at. We're looking at people who are living in an incredibly tightly controlled environment where 90% of the houses and apartments and where people lived have been either destroyed or seriously damaged, where all 12 universities have been completely destroyed, where 80% of the schools and 80% of the mosques have been destroyed, where 2 of the 3 churches have been destroyed. Only 20 out of the 36 hospitals are even partially functioning, and that usually means an ER somewhere set up in the courtyard. There's hardly anything left of the hospitals. And we are responsible. It's our money, it's our arms. You know, the US provides 70% of the arms to the Israeli military. Germany provides most of the other 30%, and Germany just announced, and this was huge, even if they condition it and don't really do it. And the fact that they acknowledged it was huge for Germany, as you can imagine. This was the first time Germany had even hinted at holding Israel accountable for anything. And this is because there's a global movement demanding it. There's a movement in Germany facing repression even more serious than our movement here, which is getting pretty bad, as you all know. What is facing the students, what's facing immigrants, what's facing anyone who is speaking out for Palestinian rights is getting more and more dangerous. In Germany, it has been far worse. And yet, there's been enough pressure on the German government that they were forced to make that announcement. We'll see what the compliance looks like. Will they really do it? We don't know. It just happened. But this is a step. This is what movements make possible. And we know that the U.S. provides, last year the U.S. paid 40% of the entire Israeli military budget. How sick is that? It's not bad enough that we're paying $1 trillion of our military budget. We're paying 40% of theirs so they can carry out a genocide? This is what collaboration with genocide looks like. At the same time, we are seeing the biggest shift in public discourse, in public opinion, and in media coverage than we have seen, I think, since 1988 and the period of the first Intifada. I've got to say, looking around the room, I'm seeing most people are of my generation, right? But still, how many of you know the difference between the first and second Intifada, or those terms? Yeah, half. That's good. That's more than usual. A lot of young people don't know there was an Intifada before, the one that's kind of well known from the turn of the century, the one that began in 2002 and went for about 3 years, which was a very militarized uprising on both sides. There were casualties on both sides, massively more casualties on the Palestinian occupied side, of course. And of course, in the context of international law, the military force used by Palestinians, a people under occupation, is not illegal. It is not unlimited. Attacks on civilians is illegal. But attacks on military targets, on checkpoints, on soldiers is legal under international law. We don't hear about that very often, but that is true. But what we're looking at is, at that time, we saw a shift that Palestinians, for the first time, since they kind of emerged on the U.S. media stage at all, mostly in the 60s, it was always Palestinian terrorists. That was the frame, right? And then during the Intifada, which was profoundly nonviolent, was characterized by children holding little rocks they would throw at the Israeli tanks. The children of the stones, that was the iconic image of that first uprising. That image changed from Palestinian terrorists to Palestinian victims for the first time. Now, being a victim recognized as a victim is a far cry from being recognized as a person with agency and rights to fight. That wasn't quite there. But it was a big shift from being dismissed as terrorists to being sympathized with, not empathized, but sympathized with in some generic sense, because of the huge numbers of casualties. You know, Yitzhak Rabin, who later became eulogized as the peace president, the peace prime minister of Israel, right? When he was in that office, because he was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli settler, but when he was in power as the prime minister of Israel, he was a far cry from a peacenik. He was the one who ordered, break their bones. He told his soldiers, first he just said, use military force, and they were like, these are children. And he clarified what he meant, break their bones. When I was traveling in Palestine a lot during those years, I was working on a photography book about the Intifada, and the photographer, the partner I was working with on the book, and a close friend, he was the first foreign journalist to be shot during the uprising. He was okay. But after they removed the bullet, they wanted him in the hospital for a few days to make sure that it didn't get infected and whatever. And he spent 5 days in the hospital in a ward with a bunch of young kids, teenagers and young men, whose bones had been broken, sometimes by being shot, sometimes with sticks and with their rifle butts. The soldiers would hold them down and beat them till they broke their arm or broke their leg. Those were the kids that Neil was with for 5 days. He came out of it almost fluent in Arabic. I was so jealous. But, you know, this is what the peace prime minister was all about. So this is what we're looking at as a systemic issue in Israel. This is not about Netanyahu alone. You know, if you look at the government of Israel right now, the government, not the Knesset as a whole, but the government, yet Netanyahu is almost the farthest left of that government. That's true. Because this is a government of the right, the far right, the extreme right, and the fascist right. That's the range. He's of the right, center right, kind of, the old school right. But he is politically dependent on the fascist right. He's not about to change that. So don't imagine that getting rid of Netanyahu is somehow the answer, that he's some outlier, you know, that the Israelis don't really want him. Yeah, they do. They do. So, you know, this is the problem that we face. But if we look at those shifts in the discourse, right now the polls show that 43% of people across the country say that Israel is committing genocide. That's pretty extraordinary. 65% of Democrats say that. Now there's a generational shift here that's very important. If you look at the number of people over 65, 38% say Israel is committing genocide. If you look at the young people, that's 18 to 29, that is 54% say Israel is committing genocide. It's a huge gap between generations. The justice generation that came of age during the racial reckoning of the George Floyd protests in 2020 have now taken up Gaza as the moral center of their identity, of their movement, of what they see their role in the world. And that gives me an enormous amount of hope. 61% of people in this country now say there should be no more weapons to Israel. That's unheard of. When I first heard that, I said, that's got to be wrong. We haven't done that much yet. It was true. It was true. And I can't say that the movement for Palestinian rights made that possible. We didn't do that. We didn't organize that. But we did set the stage for it, right? For a movement that's been around for 30 years. It set the stage for that shift to happen. So when we saw in the first months of the genocide, We saw those huge protests coming out into the streets, hundreds of thousands, 400,000 people in the streets of Washington in November of 2023, just 2 months after a month and a half after the genocide began. That wasn't because the Palestinian rights movement had pulled all those people into the streets. We can't claim that. It was because what people were seeing on their phones, on their televisions, on their computers, hearing on the radio, reading in the newspapers, seeing what genocide looks like close up, and saying, this cannot stand, this will not pass, I can't stand by. When we are paying for it, we are sending the arms, and we're standing back and saying, go ahead, we will protect you and make sure you never get held accountable. That was no longer acceptable. When we saw the uncommitted movement, a really creative movement that recognized we can do this during the primaries, we'll see what happens during the general election, but it was really brilliantly conceived. It was not by the Palestinian rights movement, but it was made possible. The ground was laid by that movement over these 20 years. But this is not obviously just about numbers. Polls are important. No one poll is important because they're snapshots. They're what it says today. Today might be completely different. But when you see over time a series of polls going in one direction, that's something you need to take seriously. And I think that's what we are seeing. But this is not just about polls. The escalation is underway. The Israeli press this morning was saying that the new call is going to be for Palestinians to be evacuated from Gaza City, where there are 1 million Palestinians left who returned to the rubble of Gaza City after being forced out in the first months of the genocide and forced to the south. They have returned to what remains of their homes, which is basically rubble, to try and find a way of living, that they will now be expelled by tomorrow, by Sunday. Tomorrow, that's what I said. Tomorrow. Now that's not going to happen. Obviously, they're not going to move 1 million people by tomorrow. That's the threat. It will start the evacuation. And that means people will be forced to walk 15, 20 kilometers on torn up roads, carrying whatever they can carry. If they have a child, they carry nothing because they have to carry the child. This is what genocide looks like. This is what ethnic cleansing looks like. 1 million people will be pushed to the south. There's now about 12% of Gaza that is not either completely occupied by Israeli troops or under the control of a so-called evacuation order, where they're surrounded by Israeli troops pushing them somewhere else, where there is also no water, no food, no electricity, and no shelter, and no medical care. 12% is left. And now they are trying to move everybody south to eliminate that 12%. They will move them into the area around the Massawi near the Egyptian border, where people, we always used to talk about Gaza as one of the most crowded places on earth. 2.3 million people. There's no longer 2.3 million. Too many have been killed. It's probably just under 2 million now. But that's a lot of people in a tiny, tiny strip of territory, about twice the size of the city of Washington, D.C. 2 million people. And we're not talking, skyscrapers here. We're talking about people living like this. So when we see that, the dangers become even greater. This so-called humanitarian agency, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, you've all been hearing about this U.S.-Israeli collaboration that's designed as a death trap to attract people with the hope of food and shoot them like ducks in a barrel when they come near. There's now over almost 2,000 people, I think it is, I think it's about 1,800, something like that, have been killed trying to get food from this place. The international humanitarian world, all the agencies, all the global NGOs, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, all of them that provide food, all of the UN agencies, and the UN itself have said, we will not deal with this group. This is a military operation, it is not a humanitarian operation. Well, it turns out that US pressure often works, and there was a leak about, today is Saturday, I think it was on Thursday. There was a high-level meeting of the leadership of the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, these US contractors, who met with both UN agencies, including the Deputy Director of OCHA, the main coordination of humanitarian aid at the United Nations. I tried to get it this morning, but I couldn't get it. The director just made a response to that yesterday, and I don't know what he said. But also the Interagency Standing Committee, which is one of the largest of the NGO world coordinating bodies that coordinates all the big international humanitarian organizations that function in crisis zones like Sudan, like Somalia, like Haiti, like now Gaza. And they said that their goal was to lower the public rhetoric. So we didn't have so many people complaining that this wasn't a legitimate whatever, so that we can do our job. You know, because the United Nations, whose UN agency, UNRWA, had since 1949 not just provided food, but food and water and jobs and engineering and education, good enough education so that Palestinians until the last 2 years have had the highest literacy rate in the entire Middle East. That's because of UNRWA. That's because of the United Nations. And UNRWA has now been discredited, destroyed as collaborating with terrorism, etc. But it had 13,000 employees in Gaza, with 1,600 places people could go to get food. These guys have 4. And they said, oh, but we're going to quadruple that. We're going to change, so we're going to have 16 places. Oh, great. That's 1% of what was made possible when the UN was providing all of these other services. This is what ethnic cleansing looks like. This is what the Nakba looked like in 1947-48, when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their land, dispossessed of their land, never allowed to return home, forced into refugee camps. This is a second Nakba. And this time, it is happening in the eyes of the world, publicly, with public US support, not cautious, defensive, apologetic support, but cheering on support, money, weapons, and crucially, political and diplomatic protection, so that Israel is never held accountable at the United Nations. It's planned, it's acknowledged, and ethnic cleansing, we should be clear, was part of the goal of the creation of the State of Israel from before the creation of the state. You know, despite the famous slogan, this was a land without a people for a people without a land, the leadership of the Zionist movement never believed that. They knew that wasn't the case. They did know, and it was right, that the Jewish refugees of Europe who had survived the Holocaust or who had escaped were indeed a people without a land. But the land they were talking about taking over was not a land without people. It was a populated land that had been so for millennia. So, you know, in any situation of settler colonialism, whether it's here in the United States, or Canada, or Australia, or South Africa, so many examples, Israel, any model of settler colonialism, there's a number of ways that the colonists can devise to deal with the inconvenience of having an indigenous population already there. You can say genocide is the way, exterminationist genocide. That was the US choice. We're just going to wipe them out. We're going to wipe out the native population because they're just not useful to our idealized version of whatever it is we think we're building. And that was pretty successful. That was also true in Australia. In South Africa, it was a different strategy. South African settler colonialism was about exploiting the labor of the indigenous population, not exterminating them. It was controlling them, so you built these so-called Bantustans, very much like the occupied territories, a truncated Bantustan of what had once been the land of a whole people. So, you know, you have choices of what your version of genocide looks like, because genocide is an accompaniment to settler colonialism in one form or another. And so for the Israelis, this was about transfer. That was the term they used. Transfer the Palestinians out. They didn't engage in mass slaughter the way the US did. They killed plenty of people. But the number of people, the total number of people that were actually killed during the Nakba in 1948 was surpassed in this current attack in the first 3 weeks. So it's not even comparable. That doesn't mean it's not genocide, because here we get to the question of international law. And one of the things that I think has been important in this genocide, the fact that it's been seen all around the world, is being mobilized against all around the world, is that people are recognizing that there is a body of law that somebody has to enforce. The big challenge of international law is there's no enforcement, right? But there's models, which I'm going to come to in a minute, about how we are the enforcers of international law. People, movements, not governments. But we can force governments in certain conditions. But the thing that was important here is that, unlike a lot of international law, which is very opaque, deliberately so, very complicated, deliberately so, designed to not be understandable by anybody except some elite group of lawyers somewhere in Geneva or whatever, the Genocide Convention and the Apartheid Convention are both really quite simple. They're quite short, a couple of pages. They're not long treatises. So the Genocide Convention is very clear. There's two things you need for acts of violence to be considered genocide. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to kill anybody. You don't have to kill anybody necessarily. You need two things. One, you need the intention to eliminate all or part of a group. A racial group, a religious group, a language group, a national group, a socially defined group, whatever it is, an identifiable group. In this case, Palestinian population of Gaza is a group. If your goal is to get rid of that group, to destroy them as a group, you don't have to kill any single person. You're destroying the ability of the group to function, right? So that's requirement number one, intention. Requirement number two is that you carry out one of 5 explicitly identified acts of violence. Only one is necessary. The first one is killing people in the group. The second is seriously injuring people in the group. The third is creating conditions that make it impossible for the group to survive. That can include expulsion, so that they get scattered. It could include denying access to water, so that people either die or leave or something else. It could mean bombing all of their houses so they have nowhere to live, and they have to do something else and can't function as a group, can't live as a group. It goes on and on. The last two have to do with what happens to children in the group. Israel has committed at least 4 of those 5 acts. Maybe 5, but at least 4. And the problem with the Genocide Convention historically is that it's always been really hard. It's always been really hard to prove intention, right? In fact, if you ask any defense lawyer, one of the hardest things, because there's parts of criminal law that are like this. They call them specific intent crimes. So it's like the difference between, grabbing somebody's wallet or something and beating somebody up to get their wallet. You beat them up. That's you can beat somebody. It's actually easier to understand the other way. If you beat somebody up just because you didn't have a good morning and you were in an angry mood and you wanted to beat somebody up, you beat somebody up and you leave. That's a crime. That's a crime of battery. But if you beat somebody up to steal from them, that's a different kind of a crime. That's maybe burglary with battery, whatever, but it's a crime with the intention of something else, of something bigger. It's not just the crime, the act itself. This time, for the first time, except maybe the Rwandan genocide had certain similarities but not identical, you had the people carrying out the genocide bragging about it. They were thrilled with the idea that we are going to kill them all. Our enemy is not Hamas. Our enemy is the people of Gaza. We're going to kill them all. The language about killing children. It was a memory for me when I first heard there was a member of the Israeli Knesset, this was actually even before this genocide began, who talked about the need to kill the little snakes because they will grow up to be big snakes. And I thought, I've heard that language before. This was the language of Colonel John Chivington, a Methodist minister who led a Colorado militia in the 1860s, who led his troops to Sand Creek and ordered them to wipe out a native, indigenous indigenous village that was sleeping on the shores of Sand Creek. And the soldiers sent out a scouting party, and they came back and said, we can't do that. It's a peaceful village. Most of them are sleeping. It's children, it's elders. And his answer was, nits make lice, kill them all. That was the Sand Creek Massacre that many of you have heard about. This was the language of the Sand Creek Massacre. Israel was claiming pride of action in how and why they were carrying out the actions that they were. Now, what was important about this was not just because a horrific thing has a name and a horrific action has a specific prohibition in international law. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. It meant something this time because of what South Africa did. South Africa decided that it was time to end the long-standing control of institutions like the International Court of Justice, the World Court, the Court of the United Nations, which had historically been used almost entirely by the white colonials, by the Europeans and the US, the North Americans, Australia, New Zealand, apartheid South Africa, etc. That's who gets to control those institutions. It doesn't belong to the Global South. It doesn't belong to people of color. It doesn't belong to Africa. It doesn't belong to the rainbow nation of South Africa. And the South Africans said, you know what? We think it does. So for the first time, in a serious way, they launched a campaign and brought a case against Israel for violation of the Genocide Convention. The International Court of Justice is not the International Criminal Court that holds individuals criminally responsible for stuff. That's going on also. But this is a court that litigates charges between countries, right? Usually it's like border disputes, that sort of thing. This was a bigger deal, right? The South Africans said, we charge Israel with violating the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention of 1948 has some of the largest number of signatories and states that are members of it, of any treaty in the world. And one of the things about it is, it says it holds responsible every country that has signed on to that treaty. To not just stop some other country, say no to some other country trying to commit genocide, but it commits them to do everything possible to either prevent or stop a genocide. Prevent it if it's imminent, stop it if it's already started to happen. It's an obligation, it's an international law. So any country that's a signatory to that convention, which is almost the whole world, is violating international law if they don't affirmatively go after Israel to stop this. The US, of course, is not trying to stop it. It's enabling it, it's arming it, it's funding it. That's what puts it back in our pocket. This is part of the reason that I wrote this book, frankly, was to talk about the South Africa model. Because there's another way in which the South Africans have played a part in our obligations this time around. And that has to do with how we build movements. So if you look at the model of the South African anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, it was already coming to a head by that time. The movement had been underway for decades, but it hadn't gotten traction, mostly because of US and British opposition, right? One of the things that would happen through that movement was that countries, mainly the frontline African states, some others, would bring to the Security Council great resolutions calling for sanctions, for banking sanctions, for an arms embargo against apartheid South Africa. And the US, and sometimes the Brits, but especially the Brits, especially the US, would veto, veto, veto. In fact, between 1970, which is when the US cast its first veto, between 1970 and 1994, when the elections were held in the now free South Africa, 1/3 of all US vetoes were cast to protect apartheid in southern Africa. South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia. What was then Southwest Africa. And Zimbabwe was then Rhodesia. So in that context, the 1/3 is going to protect South African apartheid. 1/2 was going to protect Israeli apartheid. This was an extraordinary thing. This is what the US was spending its vetoes on in the Security Council. But in the General Assembly, where there are no vetoes, the most democratic component of the United Nations, but the one whose decisions, whose resolutions are not considered binding in international law, right? They would pass these great resolutions. The US would say, we don't care, they're not binding, we can ignore them with impunity, which they did for many years. But around the world, people like us didn't ignore them. The anti-apartheid activists in countries all over the world took those resolutions that had like a menu, they had lists of things countries should be doing. Impose an arms embargo, stop trade with South Africa, stop diplomatic relations, all those things, all kinds of sanctions. And countries would pick one or two because they were under pressure from these movements which increasingly had power and influence in those countries. They would start to do one or two. They stopped trading, they stopped shipping arms, they stopped allowing trade, they cut diplomatic relations, they expelled ambassadors. And eventually a bunch of US allies started doing that. And that got to the point where in the mid-80s or so, the US was very, very isolated. During the Cold War earlier, the US had a lot of friends who were willing to say, well, South Africa, we might not like what they do, but after all, they're part of the bastion against communism, so we got to support them. By this time, they couldn't say that anymore. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to justify what apartheid South Africa was doing. So you had all these countries say, well, okay, we're not going to do all those things, but we'll do that one, and we'll do that one. We won't do this one, this one, and this one, but we'll do those. Eventually, there was enough pressure that the anti-apartheid movement in the US, which was led at that time by the Black Caucus of the Congress, which used to be known as the conscience of the Congress, and the black churches were really in the lead of that movement. And it involved students, it involved black communities, and it involved others all over the country. That movement became strong enough so that when it brought it back to Congress for the 15th time, or whatever it was, they got it passed. And of course, the Reagan administration immediately vetoed it, and they had enough votes in the Congress to override the veto. And the US finally, in 1985, imposed sanctions on apartheid South Africa. People thought that would never happen, until it became inevitable. First it's impossible, then it's inevitable. That's what we need to do. That's the model. We know it works because it's worked before. So it means that we are the enforcers of international law. We have to operate through those governments, but it's our pressure that turns it from impossible to inevitable. That the cost of not doing it becomes higher. The General Assembly last summer, just over a year ago, in July of 2024, passed a resolution that took into account both the International Court of Justice's preliminary ruling in the genocide case, which was an extraordinary ruling. It was, we're not sure yet, we're not making a final determination that this is genocide, but it is plausible that it is in fact genocide. And then they issued 6 things that Israel was obligated to do, which of course Israel said, F you, and we have no intention of abiding by it. But there is a list of things Israel is obligated to do. There were then 3 further orders that were brought. South Africa went back to the court and said, when Israel was threatening to invade Rafah, which they ultimately did, of course, the South Africans went back and said, there's got to be another set of these requirements that you need to place on Israel, and they did. And again, they are being ignored, but they are there. That went to the General Assembly, and the Assembly passed an extraordinary resolution last July that included all the things that were called for by the International Court of Justice, and all the things that were included in the advisory opinion of the International Court, which had been issued just a few months earlier, about the legality of the entire Israeli settlement process, which had never been held illegal as an entirety. Lots of things about it, destruction of houses, the expansion of settlements, all those things individually were held to be illegal. But there had never been a finding that the actual process of settler colonialism, although of course they don't use the word, but that's what it is, of occupation was illegal, that Israel had no right to have a presence anywhere in the occupied Palestinian territory, which is the entire West Bank, the entire territory of Gaza, and all of occupied East Jerusalem. And they said the settlers must all be evacuated immediately. Immediately. Now, the General Assembly looked at that and said, well, immediately is a little bit extreme. We'll give them 1 year. That year expires in 3 weeks. September 20th, 2025 is 1 year. So you can open your papers that morning and you will see that there are no settlers left in the occupied West Bank. Now, okay, we know that. But what we have in that resolution which was taken under the terms of the Uniting for Peace resolution, which a lot of people are now calling for the UN to do, which is what they have done. They've been doing it for years, relying on that resolution that says that things that ordinarily are limited to the Security Council, because they're about peace and security, can go to the General Assembly if the Security Council is deadlocked, which it has been for years because of the US veto. So that's what that resolution says. It's a menu of things that countries should do. And you now have groups of countries. The Hague Group is one of them, led by South Africa and Colombia, who have started the process of cutting military trade and transit. So, it's like South Africa has never sent weapons to Israel, but they do send coal. So there's a campaign underway, because they haven't stopped that part yet. Of all the great things South Africa has done, they're still allowing some of the coal to go through. They cut back, but so there's still a campaign around that. In Colombia, they stopped sending coal. Coal is a key fuel that Israel relies on, foreign trade. So all of these things are now starting to happen. It's up to us to kind of keep up that level of isolating the U.S., making clear that the U.S. is the outlier state. The U.S. is the rogue state here, right? And this is what strengthens our work as enforcers. The BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, has done incredible work around the world, including in the U.S., both in education and in bringing nonviolent economic pressure to bear on Israel to end its various violations of international law. And in that context, the sanctions, was always kind of, we're not ready for that in the US, right? Boycotts, yes. Divestment campaigns, yes. Major church denominations have all divested from Israeli corporations, Israeli banks, all of that stuff. Boycotts of goods produced on Israeli settlements and inside Israel proper, because there's really not much difference between them. So all of that has been going on for years. Sanctions was harder. But the reality is that cutting military aid, which is the most important thing right now, stop sending weapons. That's the most important thing. Israel does not make the weapons it needs for going after Gaza. It makes weapons of its own, but it doesn't have enough and it doesn't have the right kind. It needs to rely on what the U.S. provides. Without the U.S. weapons, right, we're going to have an immediate 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it would end because they would be unable to fight. So all those things are critical. That's not a sanction for two reasons. A sanction, number one, is a voluntary thing that a country imposes on another country or doesn't or whatever. This is an international law mandated thing to do. Stop sending weapons, right? So that makes it easier. The other thing is that stopping, for example, the military aid. We paid 40% of Israel's entire military budget last year. That was a gift. That was a gift, right? $17.9 billion. That's crazy, right? Stopping that is not a sanction. It's just ending a privilege. So, that's what we're dealing with. It's this notion as we build a movement that we are both creating the medium and long-term things, we're changing the discourse, we're changing the media. One of the things that was so astonishing this week, the mainstream media is still hugely problematic. It gets it wrong, it doesn't quote the right people, it leaves out stories. But if you compare it to what it was 20 years ago, what it was 10 years ago, what it was at the beginning of this genocide, what it was in the last 2 weeks, the changes. On one day last week, I was struck by this. The Washington Post, print edition. Above the fold this is page 9. Famine unfolding across Gaza, the Monitor says in its strongest warning yet. The bottom part is a jump from the front page. More than 60,000 people killed in Israel's war in Gaza Strip. The bottom one, Starmer vows to recognize a Palestinian state, which is not all that useful. But then you open it up to the jump. Double page. This tiny print, this is like 4-point print, something like that. Rows and rows and some pictures of children killed in Gaza with their names, with their ages, and when you get to the end, and here it has them by age, how many of each age cohort, how many were killed before their first birthday. But when you get to the end, if you make it that far, because your eyes are not clouded with tears, it says, in bigger type, the names up to this point represent less than 18% of the children who have died since October 2023. The remaining names would continue across 5 additional pages. This is Washington Post. This isn't a paid ad. And they did this because there's people at the Post who are fighting for it. And because there's a movement outside demanding it, protesting everything they get wrong, which is tons of stuff that they get wrong. But because they get so much wrong, there is a movement, and it's leading to stuff like this, where they get it right. You know, the full-page interview with Mahmoud Khalil in the New York Times on Sunday, with this lovely picture, a whole page of his words. This wouldn't be happening, you know, a few years ago. The word Nakba in the mainstream press, I think, appeared for the first time maybe 5 years ago. You know, this doesn't just happen. It happens because there's a movement demanding it and recognizing it when it does right and finding allies among the journalists who tend to be not the problem here, it's the publishers. The journalists are fighting for it inside. Some of them are getting fired for it, especially now at the Post. But they're managing to do this. And that's a reflection of what our movement makes possible. It doesn't guarantee it. It doesn't mean that we get everything right. But the question of fighting for an arms embargo, even if we don't use that name, the resolution at the UN doesn't call it an arms embargo. It says restrict all weapons that could be used in the occupied Palestinian territory. Well, okay, that sounds like an arms embargo to me. If you want to use that language, that's fine. You know, it's that. This is the lesson. We have a movement lesson. We have models of earlier movements whose shoulders we stand on. So that is what I think we are looking at here. The broader struggle against militarism, this is what we are part of. This isn't separate from the anti-war movements. This isn't separate from trying to stop the US from being not just the largest arms exporter in the world, but greater than the next 10 countries involved, including all the big ones. You know, that's our job. And building a movement to do that now includes the question of Palestinian rights in a way that it never did before. It never did before. But I think that Gramsci's version of the time of monsters, what we face now, is not a permanent time. The time of monsters ends. And it's up to us to determine how the new world comes about. Thank you.